Sarah Fay, author of the new book, Pathological, the true story of 6 misdiagnoses, Enneagram 5. We are so glad that you are here.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel like, as I said, I know you from listening to the podcast.
Oh, well, thanks for listening to it. And we're honored that you do. I'm going to tell a story that I mentioned to you before we hit record. Last week, I read a book titled Pathological, the true story of 6 misdiagnoses. And I bought it at Parnassus Books because as a therapist, I saw the title and I thought, oh, this looks really interesting. So I took it home. I read it in 2 days, right? And I told Annie, I said, man, this is a really great book. And I told her all about it. And she's like, oh, yeah, sounds fascinating. And then I got up this morning early to review our show notes for what we were going to do today.
Right.
And I scrolled up and I see this photograph. And I'm like, oh, my God. That's Sarah Fay. I just recognized your photograph from the back of the book. And I was like, oh, my gosh, I'm actually interviewing this person whose book I read cover to cover last week. And I flipped out.
That's hilarious.
I loved the book.
So cool. I love that.
I know. Talk about synchronicity,
yeah,
serendipity, coincidence, all colliding in one moment. So anyway, I know that you're an Enneagram 5. And by the way, I will admit that I kind of figured out you were an Enneagram 5 when I read the book.
Did you?
Mm-hmm. I did. And we could talk a little bit about why I had that suspicion as I read it. You have an interest in the way that people categorize themselves, which ties to the book. But you say to make everyday life easier. What do you mean by that?
The way I see it is that the do you mean in terms of mental health diagnoses in particular, or just in terms of life?
Just in terms of life. Like why is it you think that people are interested not only in categorizing others, but themselves as well?
Well, it's so refreshing to see myself as, a 5 and to say, yes, that's me. Absolutely, that's me. And to feel validated in what I love to do, which is definitely research. I'm an investigator. That's who I am. I mean, I spent 6 years in a Ph.D. program in the stacks back when you used to have real books. And I always joke that I missed the Obama years because I was just in a Ph.D. program doing research. And that's one of my favorite things to do. So being able to look at, okay, this is my personality. This is a way for me to gauge who I am, my likes, maybe my dislikes, my weaknesses, my strengths. It can be a guide, let's put it that way, and make everyday life a lot easier.
And what's so cool about the Enneagram, and I think when taught correctly, there's a humility around it, right? There's a way of saying this is a low resolution picture, right? This is not a description of the totality of this person, because we're more than just our personalities, right? But it just gives us a framework for understanding the ways that we typically act, think, and feel from moment to moment. Now, I want you to explore with me a little bit more about consolation, because I love that word. What is it that was so consoling for you as a 5? Is it because, and I'll just throw this out, female 5s are often so misunderstood?
It could be. I think because, one aspect of it that I've heard and read, because you can find contradictory information on what is a 5 exactly sometimes, but one thing that I really identified with is that I am a solitary creature. That I am that person in the cave with books. My books are all on Kindle now, but that is who I am. And as you said, as a woman, that's not really how you're supposed to be. You're supposed to be gregarious and outgoing. And I am when I'm out, but I really love being in. So that consolation, I think, also comes from aspects of the personality or, the type that maybe aren't as accepted in American culture. And even if it's the shadow side or not, being able to look at them and accept them and even love them, for who you are is something I really gravitate to. The other thing I just wanted to mention that I learned from your show was just how the Enneagram is really about self-knowledge and transformation. And that was really interesting for me, having been in the mental health system for so many years, because there is self-knowledge there, but there isn't a lot of transformation, right? You kind of get tagged a type, you get a label, and then that's it. So it doesn't take that next step. And I love what you say about stories, and we can talk about that, obviously.
Oh, I love that, because I'm all about sort of a narrative approach to the human condition. Why do we tell stories about ourselves, to ourselves and to others, to make sense of our lives? And maybe that's why we, in part, read fiction, right? Is that we're fascinated with stories. And Anthony, something I learned after I read this other book, This Is Happiness, this week, which is an exquisite novel for those of you who haven't read it yet. It's called This Is Happiness. But in it, the narrator says, essentially, we tell stories about ourselves to make sense of our suffering. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's so true.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, isn't it interesting that when we ask people to share their story with us, they spend a large amount of time talking about their suffering, periods of times that were so hard, and which is what you do in your book. Your book is really built around your suffering and the story of your suffering, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I love everything that you're saying about Enneagram 5s. I wonder, though, if you experience yourself as a person who collects oodles of information and data and knowledge around specific subjects as a way to fend off feelings of inadequacy and ineptitude. Do you ever connect that?
I don't like that part of it, but no, I mean, I can see that there are over 500 footnotes in my memoir, and memoirs aren't supposed to have footnotes. Okay. So talk about going above and beyond and being cerebral and intense. Like, I've got it. And so, yeah, I mean, I think one thing when I was writing the book is because I talk so much about the mental health system, I was really worried about seeming inadequate. I'm not a mental health professional. And so who am I to come out and have, so I knew I couldn't just say things about the mental health system or diagnoses. I had to back it up. And I kind of geek out on that. So it got a bit intense for sure with over 500 citations.
I did think that, because one of the things I do when I read a book, in fact, the first thing I do before I read a book is I read the bibliography. I want to know what they read. And if I know what you read, I have a head start on knowing you, in many ways, right? So, well, I'm thrilled that you know the Enneagram. I'm thrilled that it's helped you, but now I want to jump into the book, because I think a lot of our people, we do these live town halls. A lot of people come on. They have been diagnosed as ADHD. They've been diagnosed with a personality disorder. They've been, on and on and on. And they're just trying to figure themselves out. And they've been to a million hours of therapy. Can you just give us the arc of your story and what you learned and what you discovered?
Yeah. So I was diagnosed at 12 with anorexia, the eating disorder. And I, at the time, my parents were divorcing, and I was going to a new high school, and I was extremely sad, and I was terrified. And I had a stomach ache. I had this black pit in my stomach is what it felt like. And I didn't want to eat, and I really couldn't eat. So yes, my weight was dangerously low. And at one point I couldn't hold down food or water. So my parents reacted in exactly the way they should have. They took me to our pediatrician, and our pediatrician weighed me, and he looked at my mother and he said, anorexia. And that was, first of all, I'd never heard the word. Once I learned what it was, that was really the point at such a young age to get a diagnosis like that. I started to attach all of my thoughts and feelings and, my fears and my sadness to a diagnosis. So I was really already in the system. But what was different about my experience, I think for some people is they're immediately put on medication. And I wasn't. I was really a seeker. I mean, I was the investigator. I tried everything. So in my 20s, I lived in New York City and I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. At the time, I mean, I was walking, I was trying Chinese herbs that tasted like something that had died. Like, it was unbelievable. And, I tried yoga and meditation and everything I could. I was later diagnosed with major depressive disorder. Then in my 30s, I was diagnosed with ADHD and then OCD. And then finally in my 40s, I received a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. And at that point, I was really in crisis and I was suicidal and had been. I couldn't live independently. And I lived with my mother for 5 years. And what happened next is kind of was remarkable in that I was, as I said, in crisis. My sister swept in my book, my family, they're the heroes of the book. And I think anyone who's been through mental illness or touched by it knows the families really go through hell and they are the heroes. So she swept in, found me a new psychiatrist. I went to see him. We had the quick, consultation session. And at the end, I waited for him to declare what I had next. So did I have bipolar disorder? Was he going to give me a new diagnosis or reify the old one? And he looked at me and he said, I don't know what you have. And my whole world shifted. I was like, oh my, no one knows what I have. That was 25 years in the mental health system at that point. And I remember I walked out of his office and it was in Chicago. We were having a polar vortex. It was just brutally cold. And the whole city looked different. Like everything looked crisper, like the spindly trees with no leaves and the snow. And I just, it looked harsher too, though, because I thought, what are these diagnoses I've been getting all this time? Like, what has been going on? And I don't even know what they are. I don't know where they come from. I know very little aside from what I read on the internet and what my doctors have told me. And so that's when I started to embark on this very 5 mode. And I threw myself into research and being the investigator, it really saved my life. I was extremely fragile at that point, and research was my lifeline. For some people, it's contact with other people, but for me, it really pulled me out of suicidal darkness at that point. So I'm so grateful to it. And I started writing the book soon after that.
It's an incredible journey. And I want to recommend to everybody that they read this book, Pathological, The True Story of 6 Misdiagnoses by Sarah Fay. You do not have to have been trapped in the mental health system to really appreciate it, because it's a memoir, it's a story, but interwoven into that story is this terrific research. So actually, Sarah, I feel like I got 2 books. I feel like I got your story, and then I feel like I got a research piece that could have been written without your story that, it was so beautifully done. And here's the thing I think, and maybe we can talk about it in a moment, but, we've had such a mental health crisis in the last few years, and, more and more people are going to see therapists. There's all kinds of therapy opportunities online. There's companies hooking people up with therapists, blah, blah, blah. This is a really important time to read this book if you're starting to see a therapist. And
yes.
Okay, so will you just tell people what the DSM is? Because lots of folks aren't therapists. They may not know what it is.
Yeah. And I just wanted to speak to what you said about my book. First of all, thank you. That means so much to me. And that's what I did was basically I decided, okay, I wish I'd known everything I found in the research that I did. And so I told my story and then sprinkled in surreptitiously everything people need to know in order to make more informed decisions about their mental health. So people who don't want to read any research, like it's just in there. And one thing I hear and that I love is people read it in a couple of days. Like it's just a really quick read, which is what I wanted. And that's remarkable considering how much research is in there that can get very dry. But I knew I wanted to communicate to people what the DSM is, which I didn't know either. I didn't know until I started researching the book. 25 years in the mental health system, and I'd never heard of what's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, otherwise known as the DSM. If your eyes just glazed over, don't worry. It's sort of how I felt. It's just like, it's sort of it sounds too technical, but all it is a book. It's a manual. And so it's a medical manual, or it's thought of as that, for psychiatry. And in it are all the mental health diagnoses that we receive. And so to give you kind of a visual picture, on the top of the page will be major depressive disorder, and then underneath will be a list of symptoms, and you have to qualify for 5 of 9 symptoms. And that's kind of unimpressive, uneventful, certainly not controversial in any way. But what I didn't know is, unlike medical manuals in physical medicine, the diagnoses found in the DSM are not based on science. They are opinions. And that shocked me more than I can say. And it unsettled me. So if anyone listening feels unsettled and like, whoa, I don't want to hear this, I know how you feel. I identified very strongly with my diagnosis and as someone with a diagnosis. But essentially what it is it started in 1952, and a bunch of primarily white men sat around a table and came up with 128 diagnoses. And the book has since been revised. We've had 7 revisions now. And over those revisions, the number of diagnoses has increased. And so we now have 541 ways to be diagnosed. So 128 to 541. So it is designed to diagnose as many people as possible. And I didn't say that, actually, Robert Spitzer did. And he was one of the main guys who really was the architect of what we know of as mental health diagnoses. But to give you an idea of what I mean by their opinions, Robert Spitzer, when he was asked, why do you need 5 of 9 symptoms to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder? He said, it was just arbitrary. We went around the table and 4 seemed like too few and 6 seemed like too many.
Wow.
That is the same criteria we use today. So I'm not overstating that when I say that they are opinions. And
oh my word.
That was really very difficult for me to find out, obviously. And then I just wanted to know more. Not to get rid of my diagnosis, mind you, and I'm not asking anyone to get rid of theirs. Diagnoses can be very fortifying. They can help people. They give us access to care. They're necessary. And I want to be clear about that. For me, they were just not helpful. They just didn't, they became self-fulfilling prophecies for me. And that we can talk more about that and what that means. But it was, that like diagnoses in and of themselves are not a problem. And then also just to be clear, and I always want to make this clear when I appear somewhere, is mental illness is very, very real. And you can imagine it like an umbrella. And underneath that umbrella is the DSM and the manual that we use trying to categorize what is mental illness. So I'm not at all questioning mental illness in any way. I had one, I've completely recovered. They now know that no mental illness has been proven to be chronic. That's what my next book is about. I'm writing it right now. It's the sequel. So about how I recovered. But that is a way to think about it. So the only thing in question are the diagnoses and labels we use, not mental illness itself, just to be clear.
It's interesting because one of the things I kept thinking as I read the book is, as a therapist, in fact, I was looking this way for my DSM. It's somewhere on my shelf, but I just moved into a new office, and so I can't see it. It must be on the floor. In some ways, if you were overly cynical, one might think, well, the only reason we have a DSM is so that we can have a code, right? A numerical code that we can send to an insurance company to say, look, this is a diagnosis, and therefore it's reimbursable. My services are reimbursable, et cetera. Right? I think that's a little too cynical, just to see it that way, because I know as a therapist, though I don't have a private practice anymore, that it's helpful when you see a constellation of traits, behaviors, ways of thinking, acting, and feeling that seem to be common among a segment of the population. So let's say you get a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, right? Well, you do see among that population pretty consistent traits that play themselves out. that damage relationships. That's a sort of a key criteria, that it's interruptive or disruptive to relationships, I should say. And it gives us something, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like you need something that you can enter into a conversation with somebody else about or another professional about, and then they just go, okay, boom, all right. So that's my slight defense of the DSM. What do you think?
No, you're absolutely right. And again, I don't want to throw the DSM out the window. I've been in touch with some really wonderful people. So one is Alan Horowitz. He's a DSM scholar.
Here's my DSM.
That's an older one. And so, but as he says, we're kind of stuck with the DSM. It would be very hard to suddenly go to a new system. But to your point, there's no question that that's true. And again, I don't think diagnoses are a bad thing. They were originally started in the 19th century to give doctors a way in insane asylums is what they were called at the time, to give doctors a way to communicate with each other. That's what they were for. How can we give this patient treatment? We're going to classify it, as you said, as this, given, they didn't go quite so far with symptoms and traits as we do. But what's interesting, and I found this out, is patients didn't know their diagnoses. You didn't know. And so this idea of it being a self-fulfilling prophecy, or what concerns me now, especially having gone through what I went through, is seeing it on social media and young people self-diagnosing on social media and TikTok therapists, and it being such a huge part of our culture. One theorist calls it the psychiatrization of culture, of American culture. And so it's so much a part of how we identify and process our mental and emotional lives. And that was not helpful. It became a way not to process my emotions and my thoughts and my behaviors. It became like everything's just because of my depression, or everything's because I'm bipolar. Note, I am bipolar, not I have bipolar disorder. I mean, I was it. It was me. And so what's happened now is I have a diagnosis. I am still on medication. Please get treatment if you need it. There's not, treatment is necessary, and I want everyone to have access to it. I still see my psychiatrist, I don't know psychiatrist. He's very transparent about the flaws in the DSM with me, and we talk about it. He knows he's in the book. I don't think he's going to read the book. But anyway, so that, that's still very much a part of my life, but I don't know what the diagnosis is. I could call right now and find out what it is. But if I knew, I would start to do what I did, which is, okay, I'm waking up. I'm suddenly weirdly anxious. I feel like I'm cracking inside. Nothing's gone wrong. What is going on? I would say it's because of my anxiety disorder, or this must be mania. I must be going through a manic episode with bipolar disorder when you're, hyperactive. And now I can't do that. So I have to go, okay, what's going on? What's going on in my life? What's happening? Am I overextended? Am I not sleeping? Do I need some water? Or have I done, I do kind of a written thought meditation. Like, have I not done that? And so I really have to answer to my feelings and my thoughts and my behaviors in a way that I didn't have to when everything was because of a diagnosis.
Okay, so I'm over here writing notes furiously. So I always tell guests, I'm not checking my texts. I'm looking off to the side because I have so many notes that I've already written. It's so interesting. I say this in my workshops, but I'm always hesitant, and I give a lot of the same disclaimers that you just gave. So let's look at the 9 types just for a moment. When oftentimes, let's say at their most unhealthiest expression, right? Ones could be diagnosed as having obsessive compulsive personality disorder. 2s with histrionic personality disorder. 3s with narcissistic personality disorder. 4s with borderline personality disorder. 5s, I can't remember what the new name is. We used to call it schizoid personality disorder. I can't remember what the
schizoid affective disorder now. Yeah.
Okay. Then 6s with paranoid personality disorder. 7s with like ADHD or narcissism. 8s with oppositional defiance disorder, right? And then 9s with either ADHD or with dependent personality disorder. And so you see what happens, I think, especially with little children, is you go into an office, you present as an Enneagram 2, you're bubbly, you're emotional, you're, sometimes seductive, which Enneagram 2s can be when they're not doing great. And you're labeled something. Oh, well, this person has histrionic personality disorder. And I'm often like, I don't know, maybe it's just their personality.
Yeah, like when you were going through that as a teenager, it was such a complex situation, and he just labeled you.
Exactly. And, I love that you just went through that. So we were talking about consolation, finding consolation in Enneagram types versus DSM diagnoses are only negative.
Mm-hmm.
There's only shadow. And that's what I have a problem with. There are certain communities. So some diagnoses, autism is a great example of a diagnosis that's really positive. That community, they rally around each other. They get services for themselves. It is a great source of pride. They have changed the conversation. Neurotypical. It's really an example of where DSM diagnoses are about strength. But that's the only one I can come up with. And so if the others are really just all negative traits. And that is, like, as I was saying, there's no transformation there. It's just a dead end. It just, okay, I'm this and I'll never change. That's what I was left with.
Yes. And we're going to circle back to that. Anthony, remind me, because in a way, diagnoses are a story that we tell ourselves and others about who we are.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And that's problematic, right? That's really problematic. We have a friend, Anthony and I, and we're not disclosing anything that he hasn't on our podcast, and he often talks about with his clients and to large audiences, so I don't feel bad saying this. He has Asperger's. And he really, in a strange way, delights in it. Like, it has really helped him as a therapist. Oftentimes his sense of humor about himself is amazing. He'll go, well, there was an Asperger's moment, because he does stuff sometimes that's kind of goofy. Like he'll be in the middle of a conversation with someone he barely knows, and he goes into his Donald Duck voice, and you're like, oh, Mike, and but he'll then walk out and go, well, that's what Tiggers do, and I kind of love it about him, and it has given him a quirky kind of genius, that I really love. So, having been trained in the medical model, I was trained that when a person walked into the office, and no one ever said this, but this essentially is what it came down to, was you pathologize them. Right. You say, okay, I'm looking for the pathology. Right. And now, as an older guy who has worked with people for a long time, and this comes out of the positive psychology world, I've learned to sort of look at, okay, where are the resources here? Where are the gifts? Where's the positive things we can draw on and bring to the fore as a way for this person to move through the world with more emotional intelligence and happiness? And, and I say all that because one of the things I'm picking up from you is that perhaps the first doorway through which you found personal healing was in actually letting go of all the labels.
Yes. And also, and this is why I want everyone to read my book, and my psychiatrist actually says that every medical resident should read my book, because then they'll know what it's like to be on the other side of being diagnosed, is that it was also knowing the flaws in them. So I wasn't just rejecting something that someone was trying to give me that can help, but I understood two things which really shocked me. And one is that they are not scientifically valid, meaning they have no objective marker. This should have been obvious to me, right? I was never given a blood test. No one could show me on a scan, here's your brain. This says that you have bipolar disorder. But I never thought of it. And so there is no way to prove someone that I have bipolar disorder if someone tells me I do. It is simply my self-reported symptoms, which are opinions, and a clinician's opinion based on a book made up of opinions. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's what we have to use. Again, what's wrong for me is that people don't know that. And so I was actually recently interviewed, and I had the good fortune to be interviewed with Thomas Insel, who was former head of the National Institute for Mental Health, and Paul Applebaum, who was chair of the DSM steering committee, like the head of the DSM. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to get into a rumble. with this guy? Like, what's going to happen? But they were really, really wonderful. And when I said my issue is not, it is with the DSM, but it really is that psychiatry knows way more than the public does about the diagnoses that the public is getting. And they deserve to know the truth and at least be able to say, okay, someone's saying my 2-year-old has bipolar disorder. Maybe I should take this with a grain of salt. I mean, that's just so out of my frame of reference. And to have people be able to say, this doesn't feel right. Wait, you're telling me I have anxiety disorder. I'm not sure. That doesn't quite sit. And I'm going to get a second opinion or a third or a fourth, or take some time away or whatever it is, instead of immediately going to the diagnoses. So my project is really about awareness and just making sure that wanting to empower people, patients and their families, to have all the information. So we aren't just getting these diagnoses without having everything that we need, all the knowledge that we need. That's such a 5 thing to do.
Right. No, but, and a lot of times 5s aggregate lots of knowledge and information and they hoard it rather than share it with other people. They hold on to it. And by the way, once they get to the bottom of everything, then they tire of it and move on to another topic. Right? Like 5s can get bored. Like they'll figure something out all the way. And then they're like, okay, what's next? And they move on. What I love about what you've done is 2 things. One is you shared personal information. I mean, you are very vulnerable in this book. 5s don't normally do that. So rock on, Sarah, because you put it all out there on the table. And for a 5, that's an act of great love. That's how I would put it. And secondly, you shared the information and you also did it in a way that wasn't so clinical and academic that the regular person couldn't understand it. Right?
So great.
So, yeah, it's just genius. And by the way, everybody, I'm just going to remind you again, I'm talking with Sarah Fay, author of Pathological, the true story of 6 misdiagnoses. If you have, here it is, folks, on YouTube. There's the book. It's a great cover. Please make sure to read it because I know so many of you you wouldn't be listening to this show if you didn't have an interest in the workings of the human mind and heart. I know that lots and lots, if not 98% of you are in the mental health system. You're seeing therapists, you're seeing psychiatrists, you're making decisions about medication. I want you to read this so that you can have a better understanding of this foreign world that you have now walked into, that you might have a bigger, better, more informed understanding of what's happening in the world around you that you need to know. You just absolutely need to know. Because here's the deal. When you get tested for diabetes, they can give you a blood test. They can look at your self-reported symptoms, but they can actually test it and then scientifically validate it. It's not an opinion that you have diabetes, right? It is a fact that you have diabetes, right? That's not the case when you come in and a doctor says you have major depression. Now, you might. I'm not saying you don't. However, you have to hold that diagnosis lightly and not just, throw it on and then over-identify yourself with that diagnosis because you've just locked yourself in a room and thrown out the key.
Yes. And I think the other thing that's important is, none of this would even be an issue, and I wouldn't have written a book about it if, let's just say, psychiatrists and the most trained people in the country, in the world, were the ones using these diagnoses. But the reality is, and this is why my book is different, it's different in many ways, but my situation is more of what most people are experiencing now, which is that 5 of my 6 diagnoses came from primary care physicians, not mental health professionals. So they didn't come from psychiatrists. So my book is not at all anti-psychiatry or anti-psychology at all. I'm totally pro those things. But mine came from family doctor or my GP. And it came during an annual visit after 15 minutes. And that's what's happening now. So GPs prescribe 80% of all antidepressants. They also prescribe 50% of all antipsychotics to children. Meanwhile, according to a University of Michigan study from 2019, less than a quarter of medical schools offer more than 12 hours of psychiatric training to GPs. 12 hours. That's like a season of Grey's Anatomy. Like what are we, and so, and I don't mean to make light of it, because they're also trained in the most inpatient care. So not the patients that they'll be seeing, the most severe symptoms. And they are trained to give a diagnosis. And again, the other issue is that when they were asked, how do you feel comfortable giving a diagnosis? Most of them said very comfortable. So there's a disconnect. You've got people who aren't trained feeling very comfortable giving us and our children diagnoses. And that's something that we need to and one thing I really recommend for everybody, and this is a luxury, but if you get a diagnosis from a GP and you can see a mental health professional, preferably a psychiatrist, do get a second opinion. If you can't, because a lot of people don't have that access to care, ask your GP to consult with a psychiatrist and verify the diagnosis. So that's something, and I know it's hard to question our doctors. I agree. I'm that way too, but those are two things we can do that will really make a difference.
Yeah. It's so interesting you should say that. Years ago, I had a client, this is many, many years ago, and he came in and was reporting something that sounded like a depression, right? I'm not an MD. I happen to know a guy, he was at Yale. I was living in Connecticut at the time. And I said, I really want you to see a guy. And I said, I don't want you to see your GP, because I said, a GP, is going to throw 20 milligrams of Prozac at you, which I could do, you know what I mean? If I had the license to do it. And he's going to say, pat you on the shoulder and say, hope all is well. Right. So I sent this guy to him, Anthony. And this guy was brilliant. He was like the best, the most renowned expert on bipolar disorder in the country at the time. And he looked at him. He just looked at him, right? And he just noticed some feature. I can't remember what it was. I want to say he was a young guy and he had, I don't know, anyway, he said, you don't have a depression. You have a rare endocrinological disorder, and one of its symptoms is depression. And they treated that, and the depression lifted.
Oh, my word.
Now, if he'd gone to most GPs as, you're just depressed, and missed the deeper diagnosis that only a really great psychiatrist, who, by the way, has kept up on the literature, which tons of psychiatrists do not. So I'm always looking around for a psychiatrist, usually at university hospitals who are involved in research, who really know this stuff, because otherwise, someone's going to slap a label on you, give you the drug that, everybody wants, says this is the one that works. It could be the drug du jour, by the way. And now this is an important thing. And this was so revelatory for me. Talk about big pharma, the DSM, and the relationship between diagnoses and, the question I'm asking.
I do. I just want to preface this by saying that I am not anti-medication. There is a kind of a trend. It's been going on for a while, and it certainly hit me when I was going through this, which is pill shaming. This idea that somehow you're weak if you take medication, or something is wrong with you, or the only way to be healthy is to go off of your medications. The problem with that is, if you're like me, I've been on, my medication for over, I guess it's almost 14 years now. A lot of the medications that we get were only tested for 3 months. They were only intended for you to be on them for 3 months to get you out of a bad patch. So it was never tested how long you could stay on them. And there's very severe withdrawal side effects from trying to go off medication. So please do not ever try to go off. I did, and it was horrible. I almost died. I will never try again. I shouldn't say never, but I'm not looking to do that. But I just want to be clear about that. That said, big pharma or pharmaceutical companies have a very sort of sinister relationship with the DSM and the mental health diagnoses. Their involvement in mental health diagnoses is really unsettling. So I just want to warn everybody, but 70% of the people who authored the most recent edition of the DSM, so they are the ones who came up with binge eating disorder and prolonged grief disorder, which is new, and 70% of them had ties to big pharma, meaning that their research is funded by pharmaceutical companies. So it's not as if pharmaceutical representatives are in the room creating diagnoses, but they do other things. And this was the most shocking to me. They're called disease awareness campaigns or market the diagnosis. And what happens is, so I'll give you a very specific example. In 2001, a company called GlaxoSmithKline had developed a drug called Paxil. It was an antidepressant, and Prozac was the drug. It had stolen all of Paxil's thunder. They had no market, and they had to come up with another diagnosis for Paxil to treat so they could create another consumer market. And they flipped through the pages of the DSM and they found this very obscure diagnosis called Generalized Anxiety disorder that affected 1% of the population. It's now the most common diagnosis. Okay. And it's upwards of 11, maybe 17%, depending on what statistics you look at. But they ended up getting approval from the FDA for Paxil to treat it. So it's also an anti-anxiety. And what they did, which is both sinister and brilliant, is they didn't market Paxil. They marketed generalized anxiety disorder. And what they did is they create fake patient advocacy groups. They also fund patient advocacy groups. And those advocacy groups then popularize the diagnosis. And they pay doctors to say, oh, these people have this diagnosis, but they don't know it. And so that is just a couple of the ways that pharma is involved. And the only reason why I'm not anti-medication, besides the fact that I'm on it and probably will be for the remainder of my life, is that since we know so little about diagnoses and what to do and how to help people with their mental and emotional suffering, I feel like, if it's enneagram work or it's meditation or it's walking or it's a pharmaceutical drug, whatever helps you, like we kind of have to just use all our resources right now is how I feel.
And you mentioned this in the book, and I'll just a moment of sort of transparency. I have been on the same medication for 30 years, and it saved my life. It really saved my life. Now, I will tell you a story. I literally did my own, I was going nowhere with doctors, and I was really suffering for, a couple of years. Mm. And it was sort of a mixed state of anxiety and depression, right? So I was depressed, but having anxiety attacks at the same time. They call it a mixed state. And I went to a doctor. I was talking to a friend who described the exact same experience, right? And it told me what she'd been diagnosed with. I went to my doctor and he went, "Oh, I was just about to suggest that was your problem." So I was like, okay, I'm done with you because you're just stealing my thunder. I just told you the problem, right? And so then I went to see another doctor and he said, okay, well, we're going to try you on a couple of medications. They didn't work. Finally, he tried the last medication and it had a stunningly positive effect. Now, this medication is used primarily for one quote unquote diagnosis, okay? And it completely, I got to say, it healed me. Okay. It's like it healed me. Mm-hmm. So what he did is he essentially backed into a diagnosis, right? He said, okay, this drug worked. Therefore, here's the condition probably, but we don't know. You're nodding your head, Sarah. What do you think?
That's also the thing that happens, especially often with GPs, but this can happen with therapists as well, is that if the drug works, then it's confirmation that you have the diagnosis instead of you get the diagnosis and then you get the treatment. Because we don't have, the reason why mental disorders are not actually diseases, although they really wanted that to be the case, but there is no biological markers. As I said, there's no proof that any DSM diagnosis is biological or chronic. And so, but what they essentially, what they're trying to do is look at, they're kind of chasing their tails, if that makes sense. So trying to prove the diagnosis with that. And the other thing that happens, and I mentioned therapists, is that it's also the diagnosis is justified by the behavior, and the behavior justifies the diagnosis. So you have social anxiety disorder because you do not go to public events, or you don't like being in social situations. You don't like being in social situations because you have social anxiety disorder. So again, it's that circle of, because we have no other way to prove it. What I love though is go ahead.
No, go ahead. You keep going. I love it when you say I love.
So I just love this one. Often, we try to say, oh, mental illness or DSM diagnoses, mental health diagnoses are just like physical diagnoses. And particularly, you mentioned diabetes. We love that comparison. But it's really nothing like diabetes, and it's nothing like cancer. I mean, we should treat them as seriously as those. And I think that's part of the, motivation behind saying that. But what I love is the example of a broken bone. That even having a psychotic break, even being in crisis, like I was, is like breaking a bone. And when the bone breaks, and I didn't know this, but in physical medicine, the point of healing, so the point where the bone had broken becomes the strongest part of the bone. Mm-hmm. And I just like that. That's now the controlling metaphor of my new book, because I take that a little bit farther, which is that, okay, some people, the bones don't heal right. And you may always have a limp. And for some people, you may always need pain medication, or Advil or whatever it might be for chronic pain. So there's recovery is going to look very different for each person. But right now we're treating them as lifelong, and we're assuming all these things that we just don't. I don't understand why we think giving people hope would be a bad thing. I just don't understand how we could possibly take that from people.
Yeah. And what if, you use the example of social anxiety. What if you went to a doctor, and let's say it's not debilitating, but it's disruptive, right? What if you went to a doctor and he or she said, well, maybe you're shy.
Yeah. What
if it's your personality, right? Instead of a diagnosis. So I think of Enneagram 5s. Lots of Enneagram 5s do not like to be at big parties. They don't like to be at places where there's a lot of loud noise because it's draining. There's too much stimulation in the environment. They don't like small talk. They feel uncomfortable with small talk, right? I could go on and say that in many cases, they could walk into a doctor or psychiatrist's office and they would be immediately diagnosed, not as a 5, or in other words, I'm not saying that they should use the Enneagram in those offices, but they instead of someone saying, well, that's just the way that your personality is, and that's okay.
And the sad thing is that to be labeled with this condition prevents you from doing your work and becoming, moving through that, growing through that. You alluded to that a minute ago, Sarah.
But if it's too disruptive, if you can't go to the office, if you can't do your life, right? Well, then you might need, a course of some kind of, we call them anxiolytics, so some kind of, anxiety, medication, which you have to be incredibly careful. But, sometimes interventions are necessary for people to function normally in the world, right? In a way that feels fulfilling.
What you just brought up is so important, and I didn't know this, and it also came as a shock, is that the DSM can't define dysfunction. So supposedly a mental, behavior, thought, and emotion and experience becomes a mental disorder when it's dysfunctional. But we have no measure of dysfunction. Wow. So we took Enneagram types, a 2's anxiety disorder is going to be totally different than an 8's or something like, along those lines. But so not knowing that, again, what started to, it used to be that dysfunction, and this was in the 1990s, meant that you really couldn't work and you probably couldn't live independently. That was sort of the ballpark that they were working in. And now, and I often hear this, it interferes with my quality of life. Well, my cat interferes with my quality of life half the time. This is very needy, and I'm a 5, and it's just like, I don't know which type he would be, but so quality of life. I mean, to be honest, being human, all the emotions that are part of that interferes with quality of life if you look at it that way. So that's another big problem. And then you also raised a great point, which is that most of the time when you receive a diagnosis, and certainly all the time, most of the time from primary care physicians or GPs, is that personality is not taken into account, and neither is context. So what troubles me is you've got kids growing up, children of color growing up in economically deprived areas, and they're being diagnosed with ODD, which is oppositional defiant disorder. I'd be pretty angry if I grew up in that environment too, or sad, or whatever it might be. And it allows us to really sidestep a lot of injustices in the world, but also even just a person's own life. I mean, what do we consider justifiable grieving? What do we consider justifiable depression? I grieved, and this is in the book, but I grieved for 2 years, seriously grieved for 2 years for my cat who had died, and I'd had her for 16 years. Cat people will understand what I'm saying, all the cat listeners. But, that was not acceptable. And I was given a diagnosis of major depressive disorder. So again, that context is just so, so important on so many different levels.
Yeah, but when you only have 15 minutes with a doctor, they don't have time.
Yeah.
Right.
No, they don't.
Right.
And to be sympathetic, I mean, I have no idea what it could possibly be like to be a GP. You're responsible to know everything. I mean, that's like, that's so much to ask. And I did hear from a pediatrician who said right now, especially with the pandemic and the mental health crisis among children and teens, he said he's just overwhelmed.
Yeah.
He just can't even, he can't even see everyone that is asking for mental health treatment from him.
Okay, well, this conversation could go on forever because I am having, Anthony, am I having fun?
Oh, yeah.
Because I am now into my geek sort of space, right? Where I just love to have a conversation around topics like this one. But, when I read the book, and I want to close up with this a little bit, let's be honest. And I think you would say this, okay? And I hope I'm not overstepping here. But, I've watched what your life was like on that journey. And for lack of a better word, this is not terribly sensitive. You were kind of a mess. I mean, I
think that's valid. That's a very valid, I would agree. I've called myself that many times.
So, I mean, you were really struggling, right? To hold it together, right? Suicidal ideation, you're living at home, you're having trouble at work, you're having panic episodes at the blackboard. I mean, everything going on here. Substance abuse, which, by the way, you don't mention as one of the diagnoses, because although, man, you were pounding it, right? I mean, I don't know if you...
The only reason I didn't is one, I was never given it. And then the second one is that I quit so easily without any assistance. And so I just never thought of myself as an alcoholic. And so I've just never owned that diagnosis, I guess.
Right.
So, yeah. But I wanted to kind of give an example of where someone could be living very, destructively. And I don't know if I was or not, but it did pass in time. I mean, I did know I've got to stop. Like this is not, I'm not going to do well.
And that may have been your own self-treatment plan, right? I mean, that's, for dealing with anxiety, for other things, right? I mean, that you didn't need a script for that one. You could just go to the liquor store,
Exactly.
But here's the thing. I think this would be helpful for people. You go through this journey, you're a complete mess. And now I'm talking with you, and here I see an ebullient, apparently joyful, life-fulfilled human being. And I'm, after all these diagnoses, after all these medications, after this, life is a troubled, as a guest on this troubled earth, I mean, how is it now that where can I say the word healing? Like how did you arrive at this place that millions of people who are a mess are trying to find?
Well, that's my next book. So I'll have it for everyone in a much clearer way, more detailed way. But I really talk about, it was very hard and it was a lot of work. Like you talk about doing the work all the time. And it was a lot of work, and it's a lot of work, quote unquote, every day. A lot of it has come from, for me, it was not, I mean, even, I have a label, I have a diagnosis, but not having that be even a part of my life. It just was not helpful for me. And really having to just live my life as someone who I kind of see it as, if we go back to the broken bone metaphor, I broke every bone in my body. That's how much of a mess I was. That's what it was like. And so I don't even want to call them limitations, but someone who broke every bone is not going to go bungee jumping probably, and probably not going to go skiing even. So there are certain things I don't do. I don't actually travel. I mean, I will if I have to, but I don't do that. I don't drink. I don't smoke. I don't drink caffeine. I mean, I go to sleep at the same time like a child. I wake up at the same time. And, I live a very quiet life. And that's been really important for me and really necessary for me. And this kind of circles back to the consolation I felt when I read the 5 type, and that matched me, because this has been so consoling for me. So I think one thing, and then there's a lot of other very, kind of concrete things that I do as well every single day. Writing the book and this being me really trying to empower people to have more agency over their mental health has been huge. Having purpose. I mean, we know that to heal, and this I'm taking again from Thomas Insel, who has a new book called Healing, Our Path from Mental Illness to Mental Health. It's a wonderful book. But one thing he taps into, and this is a long history of people who've said this, but to heal, you need 3 Ps. You need people, so you need support, place, somewhere to do it, and purpose. And I had my family, and I had my mother's home, and I had my purpose became, always was writing and teaching, but then it became this book, and now really just trying to, more of a public awareness campaign, and my nonprofit, the foundation, the public awareness campaign that I started. And that's made all the difference. But it's not like I didn't have purpose before. So I think anyone not having any one of those P's, you're not going to heal. And it's interesting. I live next door to essentially a transition home for people with serious mental illness. And so they're always outside smoking, and I pass them every day. And I just think, I feel such an alliance with them. And I just think, how could you possibly be expected to heal when you have no home? That's just unfat. I mean, how could you? That's just, no, it's not possible. I mean, I shouldn't say that. I hope it is possible for someone, but so I'm just always reminded of how fortunate I am, and so grateful for what I've had.
Yeah. And I think can you just give me those 3 Ps again? Because I think for everybody, and I know this is in the new book, right?
Yeah, it will be in the new book. And it's also in a book by Thomas Insel, and it's called Healing is his book. But it's also, I think you could probably look up the 3 Ps or Google it, and that would come up too. But it's people, place, and purpose. So we need support, somewhere to live, and be supported. And, because you can't just live anywhere. I mean, if you're in an abusive environment or a dysfunctional environment, obviously that's not a place of healing. So it's interesting because in the 19th century, they had their asylums, were really rehabilitation centers before psychiatric institutions really went awry and they started overcrowding them. But there were music rooms and libraries and gardens, and the patients tended the gardens. And so I kind of joke, without knowing my diagnosis and living this very tranquil life, I'm basically living in the 19th century. So anyone wants to visit, just let me know.
All right, everybody. I'm talking to Sarah Fay, and I feel like you're my new friend.
You're my new friends.
I loved this book so much. Everybody, it's called Pathological, The True Story of 6 Misdiagnoses. It is terrific. Sarah, we have loved having it. We love it when Enneagram 5s come on the show. My 2 best friends I'm talking 40-year friends, are both Enneagram 5s. They offset my very emotional Enneagram 4. They bring me a much needed critical thinking mind, which I need from time to time to get me off of the emotional roller coaster. And Sarah, where do people learn more about you and all that stuff?
So I'm at sarahfay.org, SARAHFAY.org. And then I'm at Sarah Fay author, all one word, on all socials.
Great. Well, Sarah, peace and wonderful things to you. And so much, we just hope for so much success for this book, because as I mentioned, super, super timely as people rush into the mental health system right now. And we didn't get a chance to talk about the state of the world and the culture post-pandemic and et cetera. And just for them to become informed, I don't want to say patients. What are we going to call them? Informed broken bones. I don't know what to say. That's a terrible way of putting it. But Typology Tribe, remember this. May you have love. May you have joy. May you have peace. May you have healing. May you have rest. Until next time.